We call it a morning ritual, but strip away the branding and the barista art, and what you're really looking at is the world's most successful smuggling operation. It didn't start in a boardroom, it started in the dirt of the Ethiopian highlands, around 850 CE. One shepherd, a flock of goats twitching with unnatural energy, and a red berry that promised to cheat the one thing humans can't escape: exhaustion. From that moment, the bean didn't just spread, it escaped. It was put on trial in Mecca, smuggled out of Yemen, and used to fuel the industrial engines of Europe. It's a commodity that toppled kings and built empires on the backs of the exploited. But before we open the file, as always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're lying down to rest, trying to fall asleep, or just curious about ancient beliefs, thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. A fire burned in the street of Mecca, not for a murder, not for a revolt, for coffee. Men in authority dragged sacks of beans into the open, ripped them wide, and dumped the black treasure onto the stones. Someone struck flint, sparks jumped, smoke rose. The crowd watched a new habit turn into a public warning. The officials did not argue about taste, they argued about control. They saw a drink that kept people awake at night, talking in groups, trading rumors, organizing thoughts. They did not want alert minds, they wanted obedient bodies. Coffee arrived in the world with a lie and a panic. That tells you enough. Ask 10 people where coffee began, and you will get the same story. A goat herder named Kaldi in Ethiopia notices his goats bouncing off the rocks after chewing red berries. He tries them, he feels the jolt. A monk scolds him. A fire roasts the beans by accident. The first cup happens. It sounds clean, it sounds marketable. It sounds like a tourism brochure, with better lighting. Nobody can prove it. No court record, no merchant ledger, no dated manuscript from the 9th century that says, Kaldi found coffee, and here is what he charged per sack. The legend survives because it flatters everyone. It gives Ethiopia the origin, it gives monks the moral frame, it gives coffee an origin story that sells mugs. History does not work that way. History works like contraband. It slips across water in the dark. It changes names. It picks up new friends. It leaves bodies behind. Start with the plant. Coffea arabica grows wild in the highlands of what we now call Ethiopia. That part holds up. The genetics point there. The ecology points there. If you want a birthplace for the species, the forests near the old kingdoms give you one. Coffee did not appear in Yemen by spontaneous generation. Seeds do not fly across the Red Sea on prayers alone. People in the region knew the berries before anyone wrote about cups and cafes. A stimulant in a bright red skin does not stay secret for long. Someone chewed it, someone ground it. Someone mixed it with fat as a travel ration. Someone fed it to a tired body at a bad hour. Humans run experiments on everything they can swallow. They run them without permission and without notes. The problem is proof. Coffee began as a practice before it became a product. Practices leave rumors, not paperwork. Products leave receipts. Written records do not give Ethiopia the first drink. Written records point to Arabia, to Yemen, to a time when the drink already looked like a system. That matters because systems attract power. Power attracts violence. Violence attracts historians. That is why we can see Yemen. Picture the Red Sea as a narrow hallway. On one side you have the Horn of Africa. On the other you have Arabia. Boats cross it in hours on a good day. Traders cross it when the wind cooperates. Pilgrims cross it with desperation. Armies cross it when they smell profit. Coffee could have crossed it 100 times before anyone stopped to write a line about it. When the drink shows up in Yemen, in the historical record, it does not arrive as a cute novelty. It arrives as a tool. Men in Sufi orders used it to stay awake for night prayer. You can dress that up as devotion. You can also read it as a performance aid. A stimulant lets you push the body past its normal limits. A stimulant turns fatigue into a problem you can solve with a bowl and hot water. A stimulant makes discipline easier, and discipline makes institutions strong. Institutions rarely share their tools. Yemen had the terrain and the motivation. The mountains near the western coast offered cool nights, mist, and slopes that coffee plants can tolerate. Farmers carved terraces into hard land and turned small valleys into green steppes. They did not do it for romance. They did it for survival and trade. The old story from Yemen gives you another origin myth. A man named Omar, a healer or a mystic depending on who tells it, lives in exile. He chews berries, finds them bitter, roasts them, boils them, drinks the liquid, and survives. The people see a miracle. The authorities welcome him back. Coffee becomes the proof. That story also has the right shape. Exile, hunger, discovery, redemption. It makes coffee look like a gift, not an invention with commercial consequences. Treat it like a witness statement from a drunk. It might contain a real detail. It also protects someone. Yemen did not just drink coffee. Yemen grew it with intent. Yemen turned it into a commodity with a choke point. The choke point had a name, mocha. Mocha was not a flavor. Mocha was a port. Ships came in and went out. Brokers weighed sacks. Officials watched the doors. News traveled with the cargo. Money traveled with the news. That port sat close enough to the farms, close enough to the shipping lanes, and far enough from rivals to act as a gate. Gates create monopolies. Monopolies create rules. Rules create enforcement. Yemeni traders and rulers did not want coffee plants taking root elsewhere. They did not want Java growing it. They did not want Venice roasting it. They wanted everyone else to buy beans that came from their hills and passed through their hands. So they tried a trick that sounds crude because it was crude. They roasted beans before export. Roasting kills the seed. A roasted bean cannot sprout. Roasting also adds value and mystery. A buyer cannot plant it. A buyer cannot trace it. A buyer must return to the source for more. That is the first real conspiracy in coffee history. People usually save the word for modern boardrooms. Yemen ran the original playbook with fire and water. Coffee did not spread because coffee was lovable. Coffee spread because coffee paid. The drink reached Mecca and Medina with pilgrims and merchants. It reached Cairo with scholars and sailors. It reached Damascus with administrators and soldiers. It reached Istanbul with men who loved any excuse to build a social club that did not need alcohol. As the drink traveled, it met the same question, again and again. What is this thing? What does it do to the mind? Who gathers around it? Who profits? Those questions sit under every moral argument you will hear. Clerics argued about coffee in legal terms. They argued about intoxication. They argued about imitation of wine. They argued about the fact that men sat in public places late into the night with cups in hand and mouths busy. A jurist can always find a phrase in scripture to match his fear. The real fear did not come from caffeine. The real fear came from assembly. You can control a man alone. You can scare him. You can buy him. You can threaten his family. You can confuse him with a sermon. Put men in a room together every night and they start comparing notes. They start telling stories about the tax collector. They start laughing at the governor. They start naming the corruption. They start noticing patterns. Coffee houses created a new kind of public life. Authorities did not invent public life. Authorities hate it. In Mecca, officials tried to crush coffee early. They staged bans. They punished vendors. They torched beans. Some rulers framed the ban as public health. Some framed it as religious discipline. The bans did not stick. People drank anyway. People always drink anyway, when a habit makes their day easier. A ban tells you coffee had already won enough followers to worry the people in charge. Cairo saw the same fight. Istanbul saw the same fight. Rulers who did not fear the drink still feared the rooms where the drink flowed. They feared jokes. They feared gossip. They feared planning. Some stories say Ottoman authorities punished coffee drinkers with savage theatrics. Even when the details blur, the intent stays clear. They wanted to make an example. They wanted to say, this cup belongs to the state. The state rarely wins that kind of fight forever. It does win long enough to make a point. The larger story in this first era is not a heroic discovery in a forest. It is a scramble over a stimulant that gave ordinary people a reason to gather and stay awake. Coffee changed the schedule of the day. It shifted night from private time to public time. It extended conversation. It sharpened memory. It let a man work longer without wine. It also let him think longer without sleep. A ruler can tolerate a tired population. A ruler can tolerate a drunk population. A ruler cannot tolerate a population that meets after dark, sober and angry. That sounds dramatic. It is also practical. Look at who drank coffee first in Yemen and Arabia. You see mystics who needed endurance. You see merchants who needed attention. You see scholars who needed hours. You see sailors who needed vigilance. You see administrators who needed paperwork. Coffee moved through the classes that already handled information. Those classes also handled dissent. Coffee did not make them rebels. Coffee made their rebellion easier to coordinate. So the early history looks like this. A plant grows in Ethiopia. People learn it has power. The practice crosses water into Yemen. Yemeni farmers and traders build a supply chain. Mocha becomes a gate. Authorities try to protect the gate with roasting and rules. Pilgrims and merchants break the gate open anyway. Clerics and rulers panic about assembly. Coffee houses take root as the public refuses to return to silence. If you want a conspiracy, look at the gap between the myth and the paperwork. The myth says a goat herder discovered coffee and everyone smiled. The paperwork says officials burned beans in the street and merchants guarded ports like fortresses. That gap exists for a reason. It hides the fact that coffee started as a controlled substance, not controlled by chemistry, controlled by politics. The drink held enough value that people fought over it before Europe even got a whiff. The Yemeni monopoly story also explains why the word mocha still clings to the drink. Brands love a name with dust on it. The name sells authenticity. It also covers the real function of the port. Mocha was a checkpoint. Checkpoint economics always end the same way. Someone bribes the guard, someone steals the seed, someone carries it out in a pocket, or in the lining of a robe, or in a diplomatic gift wrapped with courtesy. You can already see the shadows forming. Dutch traders prowl the region. Venetian merchants sniff for an edge. Ottoman officials watch the docks. Pilgrims cross borders with bags that look innocent. One living seed can create a rival empire. Yemen knew this. That is why it roasted beans. That is why it watched its hills. That is why it framed coffee as a local treasure with a religious halo. The halo discourages theft. The halo also turns commerce into identity. Identity makes people protective. Yet coffee still escaped. The drink had another feature that made escape inevitable. People could not stop thinking about it once they learned it worked. Sugar gives pleasure. Alcohol gives numbness. Coffee gives focus. Focus is not a luxury in a harsh landscape. Focus is survival. Focus helps you pray through the night, count your money, navigate currents, memorize texts, write contracts, march in heat, listen for danger, and outlast rivals. So coffee did not need missionaries, it needed exhausted people. The world had plenty. In the Ethiopian highlands, farmers did not run coffee like a global empire in the early era. They lived among wild plants and local use. They did not have the port monopoly. They did not have the shipping machine. Yemen had that. The story does not flatter anyone, so people avoid telling it this way. Ethiopia provided the plant. Yemen provided the system. The system shaped the modern world more than the plant did. When coffee crossed from Yemen into the wider Middle East, it carried the marks of its origin. It carried the smell of roasting. It carried the habit of late-night gathering. It carried an association with prayer and law and argument. It carried a whiff of contraband. Even the language hints at the confusion and the fight. People argued about what to call it. Some terms linked it to wine, some linked it to strength. People often name new drugs by comparing them to old ones. Language is a form of evidence. It tells you people did not know what they had, only what it did to them. Coffee made people talk. Authorities tried to silence them. That is the real beginning. A final detail matters before we move on. Coffee in this era did not taste like the watered-down office sludge that people pretend to enjoy today. It hit hard. It came thick. It came bitter. It came without milk. It came without sugar in many places. It was a functional drink first. People later turned it into dessert. That matters because the early drinkers did not chase comfort. They chased effect. They wanted to stay awake. They wanted to stay sharp. They wanted to stay in the game. You will see the same motive repeat in every era. Traders want an edge. Governments want revenue. Clerics want discipline. Workers want stamina. Brands want loyalty. Everyone wants control over the habit. Coffee simply offers a neat way to buy time inside your own head. They kicked the door in at dawn and found the cups still warm. Men scrambled to hide what sat in plain sight the night before, a pot stained black, a grinder that smelled like smoke, small bowls with a bitter film stuck to the rim. The raid did not target alcohol. The raid did not target weapons. The raid targeted coffee. A judge signed the order. A preacher supplied the language. A local strongman supplied the muscle. They did not want a drink. They wanted to smash the room that came with it. Start in Yemen again because the pipeline ran through Yemen. The mountains grew the beans. Mocha ran the gate. Traders packed the sacks. Pilgrims carried the habit. That habit hit the Hijaz first. Mecca and Medina ran on human traffic. Every year, people arrived with dust on their faces and prayers on their tongues. They carried stories, diseases, and new appetites. Coffee rode in with them. A drink that kept a worshipper awake fit the schedule of a holy city that never really slept. Mecca did not greet coffee with curiosity. Mecca greeted coffee with suspicion, because the people who first embraced it did not drink quietly. They drank in groups. They drank at night. They argued. They recited. They sang. They treated the cup like a ticket into a private world that sat right in the open. The authorities watched it grow and saw the outline of a problem. Coffee houses gave strangers a reason to sit together without a family tie. That alone upset the local order. Add politics, add gossip, add petty grievances, add the usual grievances that every tax system produces, and the room starts to look like a threat. Rulers in the region already knew what happens when crowds find an excuse to gather. They had seen sermons ignite riots. They had seen marketplaces turn into flashpoints. They had seen pilgrims spark tension with locals over nothing more than a look. Coffee houses added a new ingredient, one the state could not tax easily at first. Caffeine sharpened attention. It held men in a room longer. It kept them upright after the day should have knocked them down. A tired man goes home. An alert man stays and talks. Talk turns into planning faster than any ruler likes. So the bans started early. In Mecca, officials and jurists fought over coffee in the early 16th century. They did not fight over flavor. They fought over the word intoxication. They fought over public order. They fought over the sight of men lingering after prayer instead of leaving. Some sources describe a dramatic public burn of coffee beans and grounds. Whether every detail holds up in every telling, the pattern does. Authorities tried to stamp it out with spectacle. They made coffee look like contraband. They treated the beans like evidence from a crime scene. A government does not stage a public burn of a food item unless it fears what that item brings with it. The drink kept moving anyway, because the routes that fed Mecca fed the rest of the region. Cairo sat on the Nile and on the map of every serious trader. Cairo also held a large community of scholars and Sufi orders, people who already worked late and debated hard. Coffee slid into that world like it belonged there, because it did. A nightly chant and a nightly cup make natural partners. The cup kept the eyes open. The chant kept the mind focused. The room filled with men who could not stop talking. That room drew the attention of moral police and local power brokers fast. They heard music, they heard laughter, they heard a kind of social freedom that did not require wine. They could not tolerate it. Cairo did not run on pure theology. Cairo ran on factions. Mamluk elites, merchants, scholars, Sufi lodges, judges, street toughs, and ordinary workers all pulled at the city in different directions. Coffee houses became neutral ground, which means they became contested ground. A neutral ground lets rivals meet. A neutral ground lets ideas jump from one social circle to another. A neutral ground lets an angry artisan speak in front of a minor official and discover the official shares the same complaints. That scares systems built on hierarchy. When officials tried to shut coffee houses, the owners found ways around it. They moved the gatherings. They served the drink in private homes. They rebranded a coffee house as a place for games or poetry. They leaned on patrons with influence. They bribed guards. They appealed to judges. A ban needs discipline from the top to succeed. Most regimes do not run on discipline. They run on deals. Coffee thrived on deals. The same story played out across the Ottoman world, only louder. Istanbul took coffee and turned it into infrastructure. Around the middle of the 16th century, entrepreneurs opened some of the first known coffee houses in the city. People called them places to drink, places to talk, places to hear news. The name hardly matters, the function matters. Coffee houses in Istanbul became information markets. People brought letters. People repeated gossip from the docks. People shared news from the frontier. People tested jokes about officials and watched who laughed. A coffee house did not just sell caffeine, it sold an audience. The state noticed. The Ottoman court had reasons to worry. It ruled an empire that stretched over many languages and loyalties. It depended on governors, janissaries, clerics, and tax collectors, all of whom could turn on the center when they felt slighted. Coffee houses gave those groups a common room. A common room makes coordination easier. A common room also makes surveillance easier, so the state tried both. Some sultans and officials tried bans. They framed the bans as moral concern. They also framed them as security policy. Coffee houses hosted satirists. Coffee houses hosted poets who could cut down a minister in a single line. Coffee houses hosted gamblers and chess players and storytellers, which sounds harmless until you remember that stories shape loyalty. A storyteller can turn a local hero into a symbol. A symbol can become a rallying point. Ottoman authorities went after coffee houses when they believed the rooms fed dissent. They did not always succeed. The empire needed merchants and sailors and soldiers who stayed awake. The empire also needed tax revenue from the growing trade, so the crackdowns came and went. Every new ruler had to decide whether he wanted to tolerate a social world he could not fully control. The most extreme crackdowns carry a particular smell: fear. A regime only resorts to terror when it believes it has lost the soft tools. Accounts of Sultan Murad IV often paint him as a man who treated coffee as a personal enemy in the early 17th century. Stories say he punished coffee drinkers harshly, not because he cared about the drink, but because he cared about obedience. Even if you discount the worst tales, his posture toward coffee fits a familiar profile. A ruler looks at a gathering place, sees plots in every corner, and responds with brute force. Coffee did not cause the paranoia. Coffee gave the paranoia a target. This is where coffee stops acting like a regional curiosity and starts acting like a political technology. It trained people to meet. It trained people to trade information. It trained people to sit together for hours with a shared ritual. You can call that culture. You can also call it a network. Networks change power. Think about what people did before coffee houses. They met in markets, mosques, guild halls, homes. Those spaces came with rules and gatekeepers. A market has merchants. A mosque has clergy. A guild hall has masters. A home has a family. Coffee houses created a space that sat in between. Anyone with a small coin could walk in, sit down, and listen. That kind of access tends to irritate elites. Coffee also changed the daily schedule. It carved out a period after dark when people could stay sharp without alcohol. That alone shifted the tone of public life. Alcohol loosens tongues and blurs memory. Coffee tightens tongues and sharpens memory. A drunk forgets what he promised. A caffeinated man remembers what you said and repeats it tomorrow. That makes coffee a dangerous companion for any corrupt system, because corruption depends on forgetfulness. Religious debate did not vanish. It simply adapted. Legal scholars and clerics argued about coffee using the tools they had. Some tried to classify it as an intoxicant. Some argued it did not intoxicate, it only stimulated. Some fixated on the behavior around it: music, laughter, late nights, mixed company. You can see the law chasing a moving target. Coffee itself did not fit the categories. Authorities chose the category that justified the outcome they wanted. When rulers wanted to shut coffee houses, clerics supplied the doctrine. When rulers wanted to tax coffee, clerics found room for it. This dynamic shows up across history. Moral panic often hides a political goal. Coffee houses also became stages for informal journalism. People came to hear the news read aloud. They came to hear traveling merchants talk about prices and wars. They came to hear sailors describe storms and blockades. In an era with limited literacy, coffee houses functioned as newsrooms with no editor. That kind of news spreads fast and mutates faster. It can also expose lies from officials. A governor can claim stability. A merchant from the next city can laugh and list the dead. The trade expanded with the habit. Yemen still controlled most production in this period, which meant Middle Eastern demand still fed the Yemeni monopoly. The more people drank, the more power Mocha held. That power drew foreign attention. European traders did not discover coffee by reading a pamphlet. They discovered it by following money. When a commodity moves across empires, someone outside the empire wants a cut. Ottoman control over key routes created another layer of politics. Coffee traveled inside an imperial system that could tax, regulate, and punish. It also traveled along routes that smugglers knew better than any official. The Red Sea and the Arabian Sea hosted a constant game between customs and contraband. Pilgrims helped, sailors helped, merchants helped. Everyone helped when the margins looked good. Middle Eastern cities became training grounds for coffee's next life. They developed the rituals, they developed the brewing methods, they developed the idea that coffee belonged in public conversation. They also developed the state response. The response had three parts. The state tried bans, the state tried taxes, the state tried surveillance. Bans rarely lasted because the habit was too useful and too popular. Taxes worked better because they allowed a ruler to profit while pretending to tolerate the custom. Surveillance worked best of all because a coffee house offered a simple solution to a hard problem. Instead of chasing whispers in alleys, you sit an informant near the door and let the whispers come to you. This is where the noir part becomes literal. Coffee houses attracted informants the same way they attracted poets. A suspicious government can always find someone who needs money. It can always find someone who wants revenge. It can always find someone who will trade names for safety. Coffee houses became places where an innocent joke could travel to a courthouse the next day. People understood this. They adjusted. They talked in codes. They used riddles. They leaned on humor. They claimed they spoke about poetry when they spoke about ministers. They claimed they spoke about chess when they spoke about war. Every time the state tried to close coffee houses, it proved their importance. A regime does not pick fights it can ignore. It picks fights it fears. You can track coffee's spread across the Middle East by tracking the spread of that fear. Mecca feared coffee because it feared disorder among pilgrims and locals. Cairo feared coffee because it feared the mixing of classes and the autonomy of Sufi networks. Istanbul feared coffee because it feared organized talk among soldiers, merchants, and intellectuals. Each city offered a different excuse. Each city had the same problem. Coffee houses created a public that did not need official permission to exist. Coffee's expansion through the Middle East also created a model of consumption that Europe later copied with minor tweaks. The early coffee house served strong coffee and social access. It offered games. It offered stories. It offered news. It offered the feeling that a man could buy a seat in the world with a cup in his hand. A customs clerk in Venice opens a bale that smells wrong, not like pepper, not like clove, not like the sweet rot of nutmeg, something darker, burnt and sharp. And he watches a merchant smile too calmly, as if the cargo already paid for a judge, a priest, and a patrolman. And the clerk makes a note in ink that will not matter because the city runs on trade, and trade always outranks caution when the margins look good. Europe did not discover coffee as a drink. Europe discovered coffee as a product with a travel history and a reputation for trouble, a black liquid tied to Islamic cities, tied to late-night rooms full of talk, tied to bans and raids, tied to the kind of public life that kings and bishops pretend they can control. And when the sacks arrived through Venetian routes and Levantine brokers in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Europeans did not ask first. How does it taste? They asked. Who drinks it? Who profits from it? And what does it do to the mind? Because Europe already had a long relationship with substances that change behavior: wine, beer, spirits, tobacco, sugar. And it had learned the same lesson every empire learns. A popular stimulant builds power for someone. The only question is who. The early European encounter starts with a problem of framing. Merchants marketed coffee as exotic and practical. Doctors argued about it as medicine. Clergy argued about it as contamination. The state watched all of them and asked how it could tax the habit without letting it become a meeting place that threatens order, and the tension shows up in the stories that survive. You see Venetians bringing beans through Mediterranean channels. You see travelers describing Ottoman coffee houses with a mix of fascination and alarm. You see rumor and theology sprinting faster than shipping. And you see a continent that pretends it fears foreign influence while it buys it by the ton, because Europe does not reject the outside world. Europe just repackages it and claims ownership once it finds a way to profit. Venice acted as the first serious door, because Venice already handled goods that came from Muslim ports and moved into Christian markets. It already ran the delicate dance of buying from rivals while insulting them in sermons. It already knew how to bleach an origin story until it looked safe for a European table, and coffee fit the pattern. Saks arrived as another commodity in a world that treated spices like gold and treated sailors like disposable tools. And the people who first handled coffee in Europe did not treat it as a democratic drink. They treated it as a luxury. Physicians and apothecaries sold it as a tonic. Wealthy households served it as a novelty, and the working population watched from the edge. Because the first stage of any imported habit follows the same script. Elites test it, elites argue about it, elites decide whether it signals status or danger, then the rest of the city takes it anyway. The clergy played its usual role. It tried to police taste as if taste was a moral category. It warned against a drink tied to Islam. It whispered that the devil had brewed it in Mecca. It talked like the beans carried a religious infection, and the cynical part is not the prejudice. The cynical part is the timing. When the drink stayed expensive and rare, the panic stayed manageable. When merchants started pushing it harder and the habit looked like it could spread beyond elite circles, the panic grew teeth, because Europe did not fear coffee as a foreign drink. Europe feared coffee as a public drink. Europe feared the room that comes with the cup, the same fear that Mecca and Cairo and Istanbul had already rehearsed, the fear that ordinary people might meet without permission, stay awake, and trade information outside official channels. At some point, the church faced a practical dilemma. Coffee arrived, people drank it, merchants made money, bans would not hold without constant enforcement, enforcement costs money, and the church does not like spending money on street-level policing when it can solve a problem with a ritual, so a famous story takes hold. Some advisors urged a pope to condemn coffee as a Muslim beverage. The pope tasted it, liked it, and blessed it. You can treat that as a charming anecdote if you want. I treat it as damage control. The church has always known how to neutralize a threat by absorbing it. Baptism works that way. The moment the highest authority signals approval, local priests stop treating the habit as heresy and start treating it as acceptable commerce. The same mechanism applies to any imported practice that looks unstoppable. The institution does not fight the tide, it claims it. Once coffee gained a foothold, Europe did what Europe does best. It built infrastructure around vice and called it progress. The coffee house arrived, and it did not arrive quietly. It arrived as a business model that solved several problems at once. It offered a sober alternative to taverns for men who wanted conversation without drunkenness. It offered merchants a place to meet and trade news. It offered writers a place to find patrons and targets. It offered political actors a place to test arguments in public. And it offered the state a place to watch all of them if it chose. A coffee house concentrates the city into a single room. You can call it culture. I call it a surveillance gift. Because any government that wants to map a network loves a space that pulls the network into one address. England provides the cleanest example of how fast this moved. Once the concept caught, London saw the first coffee house open in the middle of the 17th century. People often cite a man named Pasqua Rosé as one of the early sellers, a foreign servant with access to beans and a willingness to deal. And within a few decades, London had hundreds of coffee houses, not taverns, not private clubs, coffee houses. And each one acted like a magnet for a particular crowd. Merchants clustered in one. lawyers in another, writers in another, sailors in another. And this specialization matters because it created an information economy that ran on caffeine. A ship captain could walk in and hear the latest gossip about insurance rates. A trader could walk in and hear rumors about wars that might close a route. A pamphleteer could walk in and hear a scandal about a minister, and all of it happened faster than official proclamations because coffee houses turned gossip into a market, and people always trade what they can sell. You can track the birth of modern finance in these rooms, not because coffee made anyone smart, but because coffee made the room possible. People did not need to shout over drunken singing. They did not need to fight through spilled beer. They sat, they listened, they wrote, they compared notes, they negotiated deals, and the city's elites began to realize that a cup for a penny could buy access to knowledge that used to belong to guilds and courts. And when knowledge becomes cheap, the old gatekeepers lose leverage. That is the part rulers never forgive. Paris followed with its own version. The coffee house became a place where aristocrats and intellectuals mixed in a controlled setting, controlled only by the price of entry and the risk of being overheard. And the French state already knew how to handle salons and pamphlets and rumor. It had a whole bureaucracy built for censorship and intimidation. Coffee houses gave rumor a physical address, which sounds like an advantage for the police, and it was an advantage until it was not, because the volume of talk grew faster than any police force could manage, and because the very act of gathering created solidarity. People who share a room share a mood, and moods spread. Europe's defenders of coffee framed it as rational. They praised it as a drink that sharpened the mind and sobered the body. They used it to insult alcohol. They said coffee houses produced productive citizens. They said coffee houses produced commerce. They said coffee houses produced polite debate. And that argument always carries a hidden agenda. Because the people who praise sober debate often want a workforce that stays upright and alert. They want clerks who can calculate. They want sailors who can stand watch. They want printers who can work late. They want an economy that runs longer hours without collapsing into drunken chaos. Coffee offered exactly that. So the same elites who condemned the drink as foreign when it threatened their identity began to embrace it when it improved their labor supply. Critics attacked coffee with health scares and morality plays. They warned that it would dry the blood, weaken men, inflame women, sterilize bodies, and disrupt the household. These claims sound ridiculous now. They sounded plausible then, because early modern Europe treated medicine as a battlefield of competing theories and commercial interests. And because moral panic always borrows medical language, it gives fear a respectable costume. Yet the pattern matters more than the details. Opponents used any argument that could slow the spread, because they understood that coffee did not just change digestion, it changed the street. It replaced the tavern as the place where men processed public life, and that shift threatened anyone who relied on a population that stayed either isolated or drunk. The state responded in the way it always responds when it senses a new kind of gathering. It tried to regulate, it tried to ban, it tried to infiltrate. And in England, the fear became explicit when the Crown tried to shut coffee houses down in the 1,670 seconds. Officials described them as places that spread false news and stirred discontent. The language sounds almost modern if you strip the archaic terms. The same accusation shows up in every era of media change. The state sees a new channel of information. It calls it dangerous. It calls it untrue. It claims it protects the public. It actually protects itself. And the attempt failed because coffee houses had already embedded themselves in commercial life. Merchants needed them. Writers needed them. Even government agents needed them because they used them to collect information. You cannot shut down a system you already rely on without cutting your own throat. This is the point where coffee stops looking like an imported drink and starts looking like an imported weapon that Europe learns to wield, not as a moral force, not as a civilizing force, as a tool for building networks, because the coffee house created a new kind of public sphere where money, news, and politics could mix without formal invitation. And Europe's ruling classes had a complicated relationship with that kind of openness. They liked it when it produced markets, they hated it when it produced dissent, and coffee produced both. You can see the hypocrisy in the way authorities treated coffee houses during moments of tension, when war loomed or rumors of plots spread. Officials increased surveillance, they placed informants, they monitored pamphlets, they watched who met whom, they used coffee houses like traps, and coffee house owners played along because they needed licenses, they needed protection, they needed to avoid closure, and the owner who lets police sit in the corner can keep selling cups. Commerce makes collaborators out of everyone eventually, and the customers adapted too. They learned to speak in coded jokes. They learned to shift topics when strangers entered. They learned to treat every public room as a room with ears, which means coffee houses trained Europeans in paranoia as much as they trained them in debate. A noir city loves a place where everyone watches everyone else. Coffee also changed European colonial ambition in a quieter way, because once Europeans tasted it and built habits around it, they faced the same vulnerability the Middle East had faced, dependence on a supply chain controlled by someone else. Yemen held the key for a long time. Mocha still mattered. Ottoman roots still mattered. And every war or blockade or policy shift could change price and access. Europeans did not tolerate dependence when they saw profit on the other side of control. So the moment coffee became a mass habit, European powers began to look at the plant the way they looked at sugarcane and tobacco, as a crop they could relocate into their own colonies, and that decision did not come from curiosity, it came from fear of being at someone else's mercy. The European coffee story often gets told as a tale of enlightenment, of rational men in clean rooms discussing ideas over a hot drink. That version hides the machinery. It hides the spies and the price games and the propaganda. And it hides the simple fact that the coffee house was a business that sold access to information. And information always triggers power struggles. Because a minister can tolerate a private insult, he cannot tolerate a public narrative that spreads through hundreds of rooms each day. And coffee houses did not just spread narratives. They minted them. They took raw rumor and refined it into something repeatable. They taught people how to talk about politics, as if politics belonged to them, and that is the real scandal. Look at what coffee displaced in Europe. It displaced the tavern as the default meeting spot for many men in cities. It displaced morning ale for those who could afford the switch. It displaced some forms of church-centered gathering, not because coffee made people secular, because coffee created a competing social ritual that did not require clergy, and any ritual that does not require clergy weakens clerical authority by a small amount. Small amounts add up across decades. The church understood this, governments understood this, merchants understood this, and the most cynical actors saw the opportunity. Coffee houses offered a place to recruit supporters, to sell ideas, to form clubs, to coordinate boycotts, to plan protests, to print pamphlets, to hire muscle. And once you see that, the old image of the polite coffee house starts to look like a costume over a back room. Europe's relationship with coffee also shows how quickly a continent can rewrite the story of a foreign good. Europeans called coffee an Oriental novelty. Then they turned it into a European institution. They built cafes that felt local. They wrapped the drink in their own customs. They stopped thinking about Yemen and Ethiopia and the Red Sea. They started thinking about London and Paris and Vienna and Venice. And this cultural takeover made the later economic takeover easier, because once a public claims ownership of a habit, it stops caring about the original owners. It starts caring about price and availability, and that attitude sets the stage for the next chapter, the chapter where European powers stop buying beans through someone else's port and start stealing seeds, planting them in colonies, and building a new kind of empire on caffeine. A Dutchman walks out of a guarded garden with a living coffee plant, and he does not look back, because if he looks back, he might show fear, and fear gets you searched, and a search gets you caught. And getting caught in this business does not earn you a lecture about botany, it earns you a cell, or a knife in a back alley, or a quiet deal where your employer pretends you never existed. And that single plant matters more than the man carrying it, because empires do not run on loyalty, they run on leverage, and a living coffee seedling is leverage you can plant. Europe stopped pretending it wanted coffee as a cultural accessory the moment the habit turned into a daily demand, and daily demand turns the supply chain into a choke point, and a choke point turns merchants into strategists, because Yemen held the old monopoly through mocha and roasting tricks and tight control, and Europe had already learned the basic rule of commodities. You can either pay the gatekeeper forever, or you can steal the gate. Europe always chooses theft when the math looks right. The Dutch did not wait for permission. They rarely do. They built a corporate empire in the open and called it commerce. The Dutch East India Company moved like a state with better bookkeeping. It fought wars. It negotiated treaties. It toppled rivals. It ran ports like prisons. And once Dutch agents understood that Yemen's dominance relied on keeping coffee alive only in Yemen, they aimed for the only thing that mattered: live plants, not roasted beans, not ground powder, not stories, live plants that could reproduce. And you can argue about the exact route and the exact moment, but the arc stays clear. The Dutch acquired coffee plants, and they moved them to their own controlled territory. They tested cultivation in greenhouses and gardens. They shipped seedlings through their network, and they found a place where coffee could thrive under their flag, Java. Java sat inside a system the Dutch already controlled through force and trade, and coffee trees fit perfectly into the colonial logic that Europe perfected: take a crop people crave, plant it where you can control land and labor, then ship it to the metropole and convert it into profit and power. Coffee did not need a new colonial model, it simply joined the existing one alongside sugar, tobacco, indigo, and spices. And when coffee took root in Java, it did not just produce beans. It produced the first serious crack in Yemen's grip, because Yemen could burn beans in the street all day and still lose the war if someone else could grow the crop at scale. Colonial coffee did not expand as a gentle agricultural experiment. It expanded as an enforcement project. European powers did not plant coffee in tropical colonies because they loved the taste. They planted coffee because they wanted a stable supply that did not depend on Muslim ports, and they wanted a commodity they could tax, insure, and trade in their own markets. And the moment coffee became a plantation crop, the story got ugly in a very specific way, because plantations do not run on free labor. Plantations run on coerced labor and restricted movement and violence that stays just out of polite conversation. You can watch the French learn this lesson in real time, because the French did not want to buy coffee from Dutch rivals, and they did not want to buy coffee through Middle Eastern channels. They wanted their own source, and they had something Yemen did not have: a network of Caribbean colonies built for cash crops, islands already wired for sugar production, and already stocked with enslaved labor, forced to work under brutal conditions. Coffee slid into that system fast because it promised profit without requiring the same infrastructure as sugar mills. A coffee tree does not need a massive crushing operation. It needs land, shade, and hands. And colonial systems always have hands because they import them. Here is the part that reads like a heist, because it was one. A French naval officer named Gabriel de Tleur allegedly took a coffee plant from the Royal Botanical Garden and carried it across the Atlantic to Martinique in the early 18th century. People tell the story with heroic polish, storms, pirates, shared water, a noble struggle to save a fragile sapling. And yes, a living plant crossing an ocean is not easy, yet the real story hides behind the romance. A single plant represents a transfer of economic power. Someone moved proprietary biological material out of a controlled environment into a colony where the French could replicate it. That is not a love story, that is industrial espionage with leaves. Martinique did not treat that plant as a museum piece. Planters treated it as a printing press for money. They propagated cuttings, they cleared land, they expanded production, and the expansion did not stop at one island. French planters moved coffee across their Caribbean holdings. They moved it to Saint-Domingue, the colony that would become Haiti, and Saint-Domingue turned coffee into a machine. Saint-Domingue already produced sugar at horrifying scale. Planters had already perfected a system of extraction that treated human beings as replaceable parts. Coffee fit easily into the same violence because the same people who whipped cane cutters could whip coffee pickers. The same overseers who counted sugar barrels could count coffee sacks. And European consumers did not see any of it. They saw a fashionable drink in Paris and a new ritual in London. They did not see the plantations because distance works like anesthesia. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue supplied a huge share of the world's coffee. Depending on the year and the accounting, you can see figures that hover around half. And even if you argue down the percentage, the core fact stays. One small territory under French control became a major engine of global coffee supply. And it did it through forced labor and a plantation regime that kept people in chains and kept them working until they broke. Coffee did not cause that brutality. Coffee profited from it, and profit creates silence. Because the people who benefit from a commodity rarely invite journalists to inspect the source. This colonial expansion did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a European competition for global dominance, and coffee became one more asset in that competition. Dutch coffee from Java began to circulate in European markets, and it gained a reputation for reliability. French coffee from the Caribbean competed on volume. British traders looked for ways to secure their own sources. Every power wanted a stream of beans that would keep its cities caffeinated and its merchants profitable. And the conflict over coffee was not just about cups, it was about strategic independence. Because a city that depends on a rival for a popular staple becomes vulnerable to price shocks and embargoes. And European powers feared vulnerability more than they feared hypocrisy. They also feared each other's marketing, because coffee became a brand before branding had a modern name. People spoke of mocha as a mark of origin and quality. Then they started applying the label to beans grown nowhere near Yemen. Because commerce does not respect geography, it respects the story that sells. And European traders had no trouble selling colonial coffee under names that implied older authenticity. A buyer in Europe wanted a certain taste and a certain status. The buyer did not demand a verified chain of custody, so colonial coffee could ride on Yemen's reputation while undercutting Yemen's market share. And that is how you kill an old monopoly. You steal the product and you steal the name. The moment coffee cultivation spread beyond Yemen, the original gatekeepers lost their leverage. Mocha still shipped beans. Yemen still grew coffee in its hills. Traders still tried to control exports. Yet the market began to change shape. European buyers gained options, and options weaken the supplier. That is the quiet violence of markets. No cannon needed, just alternative supply. And Europe created that alternative by planting coffee in colonies where it could enforce labor and ship goods at will. The labor question sits at the center of this chapter because labor determines scale, and scale determines dominance. Coffee plants take time to mature. They demand care. They demand picking at harvest. And the harvest requires patient hands. which is another way of saying it requires many people doing repetitive work for long hours. And European colonizers solved that problem in the only way they knew how. In the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, they forced labor through slavery and coercion. Then they treated the resulting coffee as a clean consumer good. Plantation owners did not need to invent new cruelty for coffee. They adapted existing cruelty. They built work gangs. They imposed quotas. They punished shortfalls. They used violence as management. And when consumers in Europe praised coffee houses as places of rational debate, they rarely acknowledged that the rational debate ran on irrational brutality across an ocean, not because they lacked intelligence, because the system rewarded ignorance. If you do not know, you do not have to care, and if you do not have to care, you can drink your cup and keep moving. Then the system broke in the one place where it mattered most. Saint-Domingue exploded in revolt at the end of the 18th century. Enslaved people rose up and fought. They burned plantations. They killed overseers. They forced France into a grinding war it did not expect. And the Haitian Revolution did more than change a flag. It shook the global coffee supply. Because when a colony that supplies a massive share of the world's coffee enters chaos, coffee prices respond. Merchants scramble, and rival producers smell opportunity. This is where the colonial coffee story starts to look like a power vacuum with beans, because the fall of one supply hub created room for others, and the most important other was Brazil. Not yet the overwhelming titan it would become, but already a landmass, with climates suited for coffee, and with a ruling elite willing to exploit labor at scale. Coffee reached Brazil through a story that also looks like a heist. A Portuguese agent named Francisco de Melo Palheita allegedly obtained seeds or seedlings from French Guiana in the early 18th century. Some tellings add seduction, diplomacy, and hidden pockets. Again, the details shift, the pattern stays. European powers treated coffee plants as strategic assets. They stole them, they moved them, they planted them where they could control the result, because control over coffee meant control over revenue and global influence. Brazil had two advantages that made it a natural candidate for coffee dominance: vast land and a labor system built on slavery that lasted deep into the 19th century. Plantation owners in Brazil expanded coffee cultivation in regions that suited the crop. They moved into the Paraíba Valley and later into areas that would fuel the rise of Sao Paulo, and they used enslaved labor to scale up, because coffee does not care about your laws. Coffee cares about water, soil, and hands, and Brazil had all three in the quantities that matter to a commodity empire. While Brazil rose, other regions joined the game too. The Dutch did not keep coffee confined to Java. Coffee spread across parts of Southeast Asia under European influence. The French pushed coffee into other colonies. The British experimented in their holdings, and the coffee map started to resemble the sugar map, a set of tropical and subtropical zones exploited to feed European consumption, with profits flowing one direction and suffering flowing the other. At this stage, Europe had effectively done two things at once. It freed itself from Yemen's gate, and it bound coffee to colonial exploitation. And those two moves worked together, because colonial production allowed scale, and scale allowed price drops, and price drops turned coffee from a luxury into a mass habit, and a mass habit created an even larger demand that justified even more expansion. It is the same feedback loop you see with sugar, and the loop always produces the same result: huge wealth for the people controlling trade and land, and huge human cost for the people doing the work. Europe also built the commercial systems needed to handle coffee at global volume, because growing the crop is only half the story. You have to ship it, insure it, finance it, store it, and sell it in ways that stabilize supply and reduce risk for merchants. And this is where finance and colonialism shake hands openly. Traders used credit. Futures contracts began to form in rudimentary ways. Insurers priced voyages, warehouses held stock, brokers speculated on price changes linked to weather, war, and revolt. And every layer of this system pulled profit away from the grower and toward the market centers in Europe, because that is what markets do when they sit closer to capital than to land. Coffee's spread through colonial networks also changed the cultural narrative in Europe, because once coffee became a colonial product, Europeans began to speak of it as part of their own economic identity. They stopped treating it as a foreign Muslim drink and started treating it as a normal feature of European life. And the shift was not just about taste, it was about ownership. When your empire grows the crop feels domestic even when it grows on stolen land. And that mental trick matters because it reduces resistance to consumption. It turns a formerly suspect drink into a symbol of modernity and productivity. In practical terms, coffee houses in Europe benefited directly from colonial expansion. They could access more beans at more stable prices. They could serve more customers. They could become fixtures of urban life. And as coffee consumption expanded, so did the political and commercial role of coffee houses. They continued to serve as information markets and meeting places, and now they also served as nodes in a larger imperial economy. A man in London drinking a cup now sat at the end of a chain that ran through Caribbean plantations, Brazilian estates, or Javanese farms, and he did not need to know it to benefit from it. The colonial chapter also includes another quieter conspiracy: the manipulation of origin and quality through naming and marketing. Because once multiple regions produced coffee, merchants needed ways to differentiate and to charge more, so they used place names as branding tools. They invoked mocha, they invoked Java, they invoked bourbon. They invoked exotic images that hid the basic reality of plantation agriculture. The names worked because consumers wanted romance and merchants wanted margin, and the truth of production stayed conveniently distant. Even the term Java became a kind of shorthand for coffee in some contexts, which tells you how deeply the Dutch shift mattered. Yemen did not just lose market share, it lost cultural centrality. The center moved to wherever the empire could enforce production, and the center eventually moved again to Brazil. This era also teaches a broader point about how commodities reshape geopolitics. Coffee became a strategic crop because it fed a social and economic habit that European cities came to depend on. And dependence creates policy. Governments and trading companies supported colonial coffee not out of charity, but out of self-interest. They wanted cheap supply, they wanted tax revenue, they wanted merchant dominance, they wanted to undercut rivals, and they wanted to avoid the humiliation of relying on a region outside their control for something their populations demanded daily. When you strip away the sentimental stories, coffee's colonial expansion looks like a set of coordinated decisions driven by the same logic: steal the plant, secure the land, control the labor, ship the product, tell a clean story to the consumer, repeat. And the clean story usually focuses on the cup, on the cafe, on the aroma, on the so-called refinement of European social life. The dirty story lives in the fields and in the shipping manifests and in the revolts that periodically disrupt supply. That dirty story also sets up the next phase, because once coffee became a global commodity produced at massive scale, industrial players began to standardize it, process it faster, package it, brand it, and sell it as a modern necessity. And industrialization did not replace exploitation. It simply changed the shape of profit. It moved even more power into corporate hands, and it created new kinds of control through pricing, advertising, and global agreements. Men shoveled coffee like coal, not because they loved the smell, because they needed to destroy it, and they did it in broad daylight. In a country that grew so much coffee, it could not sell it without collapsing its own market. And the sight made no sense until you followed the money. Trains ran, furnaces roared, warehouses emptied, and the world watched a government turn breakfast into fuel while hungry families elsewhere lined up for bread, because coffee had stopped acting like a drink and started acting like a weapon you could aim at prices. You can search for the moment coffee became modern, and you will keep tripping over the same scene. Brazil in the early 20th century, mountains of beans, too many hands, too much land, too much supply, too little control, and a state that decided it would rather burn wealth than surrender power, because Brazil had already climbed into the driver's seat of the coffee trade. And once a country holds that much share, it starts thinking like a cartel, even when it uses polite words. It starts asking how to prop up prices, how to punish rivals, how to keep planters loyal, how to stop the global market from treating its main export like disposable cargo. And those questions did not stay in the fields. They moved into ministries, banks, shipping firms, and exchange floors, where men in suits traded coffee the way they traded metal and grain, with distance and indifference. Brazil's dominance came from scale, and scale came from land and labor, and a brutal willingness to expand. But the industrial age did not reward scale alone. It rewarded scale plus processing, scale plus storage, scale plus branding, scale plus the ability to turn a fragile crop into a stable product that could survive shipping, sit on a shelf, and taste the same every time, because consistency sells, and the new coffee economy valued consistency more than it valued origin. It valued predictability more than it valued the farmer, and it valued the story on the tin more than the conditions on the plantation. So coffee's industrial era starts with a mismatch. The crop stayed agricultural and messy. The market demanded industrial and controlled, and that mismatch created an opening for a different kind of power. Not the power of the planter with a whip, not the power of the merchant with a ship, the power of the processor with machines and capital, the power of the brand that could buy beans from anywhere, blend them, roast them, grind them, pack them, sell them, then tell the customer it came from some imagined place that smelled clean. And the customer believed it because the customer wanted a routine, not an investigation. The industrial system needed a few inventions and a few habits, and none of them looked glamorous. Roasting moved from small batches to industrial drums that could handle volume and standardize flavor. Grinders became mass-produced tools instead of craftsman devices. Packaging improved, so roasted coffee did not go stale in days. Businesses learned to ship coffee not as a raw curiosity, but as a finished consumer product. And every step pulled value away from the origin and toward the factory, because the factory controlled the transformation, and transformation controls profit. Watch what happened in the United States as an example of how quickly industry can domesticate a foreign commodity. Early Americans drank a lot of coffee already, partly because politics pushed them away from tea. They treated coffee as a substitute, and later as a necessity. And as cities grew and work hours hardened into schedules, employers and workers started seeing coffee as a tool, a way to keep the shift moving, a way to keep the clerk awake, a way to keep the factory floor functioning, and demand rewarded anyone who could deliver coffee reliably and cheaply, which meant the companies that could roast at scale and pack at scale and distribute at scale. Packaging became a quiet revolution, because roasted coffee goes stale fast when air and moisture get to it, and stale coffee kills repeat customers. So companies fought for methods that kept oxygen out and flavor in, and once they solved that, they turned coffee into a shelf product you could buy without visiting a roaster, which changed the entire retail chain. It moved coffee from specialized shops into general stores. It turned the product into something a housewife could purchase, like flour. It also gave companies a reason to advertise, because a branded package only matters when consumers recognize and trust it, and trust comes from repetition, slogans, and a sense that the product has a personality, a ridiculous concept for roasted seeds. Yet it worked, because people do not buy only chemicals, people buy certainty. This is where the noir story shifts from ports and plantations to offices and ad copy, because a brand does not just sell coffee, it sells a version of life where coffee solves problems without creating them, and that version requires selective memory. It requires a customer who does not picture a plantation or a burned warehouse. It requires a customer who pictures a clean kitchen and a strong husband leaving for work with a cup in hand, and companies built that picture with the same ruthlessness that empires used to secure ports. Look at the language that emerged in coffee advertising as industrial producers grew. They promised vigor, they promised clarity, they promised domestic harmony, they turned coffee into a badge of respectability, and they built campaigns that targeted women as household managers and men as workers who needed stamina. And the campaigns rarely talked about origin, because origin raised questions, and questions slow consumption. So industry shifted coffee away from geographic truth and toward lifestyle fiction, not a poetic fiction, a commercial fiction, the kind that runs on repetition until it feels like common sense. Industrialization also changed taste, not by accident, by design. Large roasters blended beans from different origins to smooth out differences and reduce cost. They roasted darker to mask defects and create a strong uniform profile. They ground finer or coarser, depending on brewing trends. They trained the public palate to accept what their machines produced most efficiently, and once the public accepted it, they could purchase cheaper green beans and still sell a consistent product, which means the consumer learned to love the flavor of processing choices, not necessarily the flavor of the crop. And that shift gave brands leverage over growers, because the grower no longer sold a unique taste, the grower sold a raw input that a factory could manipulate. Then came the shocks that always accelerate industrial systems, war and economic crisis, because war demands logistics and crisis demands cost-cutting, and coffee sat right at the intersection. Soldiers drank coffee, workers drank coffee, governments wanted coffee because it helped morale and productivity, and companies wanted wartime contracts because contracts guarantee volume. And every time a government tries to feed an army, it creates a market for shelf-stable stimulants, and that is where instant coffee enters the story with a hard edge. Instant coffee did not arise from romance. It arose from the desire to make coffee portable, cheap, and fast. Inventors tinkered with soluble coffee earlier, companies refined it later. And the key point is not the exact patent date, the key point is the motive. Instant coffee. Let a company sell caffeine without the mess of grinding and brewing. It also let armies and relief organizations distribute coffee in a form that traveled well, and once millions of people learn a habit under pressure, they often keep it when the pressure lifts, because habits form quickly when they attach to survival and routine. Nestlé's move into coffee production in the 20th century shows how corporate power reorganized the commodity. Brazil faced chronic overproduction at times, and when prices dropped, Brazil's leaders tried multiple tactics to stabilize the market. They stored coffee, they restricted exports, they destroyed supply, and they looked for industrial outlets that could absorb volume. Industrial firms looked at that surplus and saw opportunity. A company that could turn cheap surplus beans into a branded soluble product could profit, while growers and governments panicked. And a company that could sell that product globally could escape the limits of any single market, because a global brand does not need a single origin. It needs a dependable stream of inputs and a dependable stream of buyers, and instant coffee helped create that global stream. Now return to the image of burning coffee, because it reveals the core logic of the industrial era. Brazil did not burn coffee because it hated waste. It burned coffee because it feared collapse. Coffee prices dropped hard during the Great Depression, and a country that relied heavily on coffee exports faced a crisis that looked like a national emergency, and officials chose destruction as a policy tool. They treated coffee like excess inventory that threatened the entire system, because when supply outstrips demand, the market punishes the producer, and the producer either accepts the punishment or fights the market. Brazil chose to fight, and it fought by making coffee disappear, which sounds insane until you remember that commodity power often means you can destroy value to protect a price. Oil producers do it, diamond cartels do it, and coffee producers did it too when the stakes demanded it. This is not a story about a single villain. It is a story about incentives, and incentives reward cruelty in polite forms, because you do not need a whip to exploit a farmer when a global price collapse can do the job. You do not need a gun to force a worker into debt when a plantation store can trap him. You do not need chains when you can lock a region into dependency on a single export. And industrial coffee intensified that dependency by turning coffee into a truly global staple, a thing millions of people expected every morning, which meant governments and companies treated coffee supply as something they needed to manage. And management in commodity markets rarely looks humane. It looks like stockpiles, quotas, price supports, propaganda, and quiet deals between exporters and financiers. Industrialization also pulled coffee into the logic of exchanges and speculation. Traders started treating coffee like a paper product. They bought and sold future deliveries. They built instruments that allowed profit from price swings, and those instruments changed how power operated, because once financiers can profit from volatility, they stop fearing volatility, they start using it, and growers suffer the results. Because growers cannot hedge easily, growers cannot move crops fast, growers cannot survive long periods of low prices without debt, while traders can click a deal and walk away. So the industrial era created a widening gap between the people who touched the tree and the people who touched the profit, and that gap became structural. It did not depend on a single bad actor, it depended on the system itself. At the consumer end, industrial companies turned coffee into a symbol of modern life, not just a drink. Coffee became the smell of the office, the break room, the diner, the train station. Coffee became part of the factory schedule, part of the clerk's stamina, part of the soldier's kit, part of the late-night student ritual, and as coffee embedded itself in daily life, companies learned to sell it with emotional triggers, comfort, reliability, productivity, belonging, and this created a new layer of control, because when a product becomes a ritual, consumers forgive a lot. They forgive mediocre taste, they forgive vague labeling, they forgive price hikes, they forgive the fact that the product came from a chain they never inspect, and that forgiveness becomes the true asset. It lets companies shape the market. Decaffeination also arrived, and it reveals how industry expands a market by neutralizing risk. Some people wanted the ritual without the jitters. Some doctors blamed coffee for nerves. Some moralists blamed it for insomnia. Industry responded by offering a version that claimed safety while keeping the habit alive. Decaf did not exist to protect public health. It existed to keep customers buying when fear threatened demand, because every commodity industry learns the same trick. Do not argue with consumer anxiety, sell a product that pretends to solve it. The espresso culture that spread in parts of Europe also fits into this era as a form of industrial efficiency dressed as style. Espresso machines applied pressure and heat to produce a concentrated drink quickly. They suited urban life, where people wanted a fast hit and a social stop. And as machines improved, cafes could serve more customers with less time, and that efficiency mattered. Because coffee always sits on the edge between ritual and throughput, a cafe can sell atmosphere, yet it also needs to move cups. So machine innovation mattered as much as roasting innovation, and the technology changed taste and behavior. It created a culture of short, intense consumption. It also created new markets for equipment, maintenance, and training. The industrial coffee system never sells only beans. It sells tools, it sells expertise, it sells branded experience. The industrial era also simplified the narrative of coffee origins for mass audiences because myths make marketing easier. Companies and popular writers repeated stories like Caldi because the story feels harmless. It cleans the past. It replaces violence and monopoly with a cute animal anecdote. And the repetition served a purpose. It protected the consumer's conscience without requiring the consumer to ask questions. And when a story protects consumption, industry keeps it alive. That is how myths become part of the supply chain. By mid-century, coffee had become something close to a global necessity, not in a biological sense, in a cultural and economic sense. Factories ran on it, militaries relied on it, office workers demanded it, advertisers sold it as domestic glue, and the trade ran through massive producers like Brazil and through corporate roasters and soluble coffee giants that could shape consumer taste and manage supply shocks, and at the same time, the system remained unstable. Weather could destroy harvests, war could disrupt shipping, revolutions could wipe out plantations, price collapses could ruin growers, and every instability created opportunity for the actors with capital and storage and influence, because those actors could survive downturns, buy cheap, sell dear, and keep the consumer market fed while growers absorbed the pain. A conference room fills with men who have never picked a coffee cherry in their lives, men with tidy suits and clean hands and polished shoes, and they talk about weather in Colombia like they own the sky. And they talk about hunger in Central America like it is a rounding error, and they slide paper across a table that will decide whether entire regions eat well or take loans they will never repay. And outside the room, people stand in lines for visas and wages and work, because coffee has a way of turning agriculture into geopolitics once the habit becomes global. Coffee's power era starts when governments stop treating it as a simple trade good and start treating it as a strategic commodity that can stabilize or destabilize entire countries. Because by the mid-20th century, coffee had become one of the most valuable exports for large parts of Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, and the money from coffee funded governments, paid foreign debts, bought weapons, built roads, and kept elites in place. And when a single crop props up a state, that state becomes vulnerable to price swings, and vulnerability attracts foreign influence, because foreign powers prefer influence through markets. When they can get it, it costs less than invasion, and it leaves fewer headlines. The coffee market had a predictable problem. It produced too much and too little at the same time. Too much in years of good harvest and new plantings, too little in years of frost or disease or war, and the price swung hard. And these swings did not just affect farmers, they rippled through national budgets, and the ripple forced policymakers to find a way to reduce volatility, which sounds benign until you look at how they did it. They built agreements that functioned like cartels, they assigned quotas, they tried to manage supply, and they tied these quota decisions to diplomatic favors and Cold War strategy, because coffee was never just coffee, it was leverage disguised as breakfast. The main instrument of this era was the International Coffee Agreement, and the name alone tells you the game. Nations sat down and negotiated how much coffee each could sell. They fixed export quotas. They aimed to keep prices within a target range, and they did it because the alternative was chaos. A price crash could topple a government dependent on coffee revenue. A price spike could trigger inflation and resentment in consumer countries, and consumer countries also wanted predictability because consumers do not tolerate sudden price hikes in staples without politics following. So both sides had a reason to cooperate. Yet cooperation in commodity markets always has two faces. One face talks about stability, the other face talks about control. The United States played a central role, not because it loved coffee more than anyone else, because it feared instability in its hemisphere. And during the Cold War, instability meant one thing in Washington's mind: the possibility that a government might drift toward the Soviet bloc or toward any ideology that threatened American influence and corporate interests. And coffee, exporting countries in Latin America, were high stakes in that game, because they were close, they were vulnerable, and they could swing. So the United States supported quota systems and price supports when those systems kept friendly regimes afloat, and it pushed for policy changes when those systems threatened American buyers or when Washington decided it could get a better deal elsewhere. And this is the core of the conspiracy feeling in coffee. The drink seems apolitical, the market is not. To understand how deep this runs, you have to accept an uncomfortable fact. Many coffee-producing countries built their economies around a crop they did not control in the global market. They controlled the land and the labor at home. They did not control the price set in distant exchanges and boardrooms. And when the price dropped, governments either cut services, borrow money, or squeeze producers even harder. And the squeeze produces social unrest, and unrest produces political openings for insurgencies, coups, or foreign-backed interventions. And you can see how neatly coffee fits into a larger pattern of resource dependency. It behaves like oil for poor countries without the same headlines, because coffee sits on breakfast tables and feels harmless, and that harmlessness makes it easier for powerful actors to manipulate without public backlash. The International Coffee Agreement held the system together for a while. Prices stayed relatively stable. Exporting countries enjoyed revenue that allowed some planning. Consumer countries enjoyed predictable supply. And the agreement also created winners and losers, because quotas determine who can expand and who has to sit still, and countries that wanted to grow production often resented limits, while countries with large quotas defended them fiercely. And within countries, elites who controlled export channels benefited more than small farmers, because the price supports did not always trickle down. Brokers and exporters captured margins. Politicians used coffee revenue as patronage, and in some places local strongmen treated coffee like a personal bank, because a single controlled export can finance a whole network of loyalty. Then the system cracked, because every cartel faces the same temptation: cheating, and coffee producers always had reasons to cheat on quotas. A producer with a large harvest wants to sell more. A government short on cash wants to export more, and the enforcement mechanisms were limited. And once cheating became common, the agreement lost credibility, and consumer countries also began to push back. They wanted cheaper coffee. They wanted freedom from quotas. They wanted a market that served buyers more than producers. And by the late 1982, the agreement collapsed. And that collapse set off a price war that devastated producers, because when quotas disappear, supply floods the market, prices drop, and farmers who rely on coffee suddenly find that the world values their labor at a fraction of what they need to survive. The collapse did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in an ideological environment that favored deregulation and market liberalization, the same wave that hit finance, hit commodities, and coffee became one more victim of the belief that markets always allocate efficiently. Efficiency in this context meant buyers get cheap coffee, producers absorb risk, And the people who preach free markets do not live in the villages where price swings mean children leave school to work. And the people who drink coffee in consumer countries rarely connect the price on the shelf to the price at the farm gate. Because retail pricing includes branding and rent and marketing and cups and labor in cafes. And those layers insulate consumers from the reality that a farmer can receive pennies for the raw product, while a corporation sells the processed product for many times more. This era also includes the rise of the modern coffee corporation as a cultural empire, because once the quota system weakened and markets opened, companies that could source globally gained more power. They could switch suppliers, they could play regions against each other, they could demand quality at low prices, and they could build supply chains optimized for their own profit. And the most famous corporate symbol of this shift is Starbucks, not because Starbucks invented coffee, because Starbucks perfected the idea of coffee as a branded experience that people would pay for daily. And when a company convinces millions of people to buy coffee at a premium price, it creates a river of cash that dwarfs what most producers ever see. And it gives the company leverage in politics and labor markets and cultural norms. Starbucks did not rise solely because it made good coffee. It rose because it sold a third-place narrative, a place between home and work where you could sit and signal identity, and that identity came with a cup in your hand that displayed a logo, and the logo mattered, because branding turned coffee into a statement, and statements create loyalty, and loyalty makes pricing power, and pricing power lets a company shape supply chains aggressively, because when you control consumer demand, you can dictate terms upstream, you can require certifications, you can demand certain grades, you can enforce contracts, and you can also shift costs onto producers under the language of quality and sustainability. This is where the modern ethical debate gets messy, because certification systems like fair trade and other schemes emerged partly as responses to the collapse of price stability. Consumers began to hear about farmer poverty and child labor and environmental damage. Activists pushed for better practices. Companies responded with labels and programs. And some of these programs improved conditions for some farmers, yet the broader structure remained. The market still set prices, corporations still controlled branding, and farmers still lived at the mercy of weather, disease, and global price swings. And many certifications created new costs and requirements that small farmers struggled to meet, which meant benefits often flowed to better organized cooperatives, while the most marginal producers remained excluded. Corporate sustainability programs often function like insurance for brand reputation. They allow companies to say the right words and show photos of smiling farmers. They allow consumers to feel less uneasy, and they do not necessarily change the underlying distribution of profit, because profit distribution depends on bargaining power, and bargaining power depends on who controls capital and access to consumers, and companies control that. And when a company can buy from many origins, it can also threaten to leave a region if growers demand higher prices. While a grower cannot easily threaten to stop producing without losing his livelihood, so the bargaining is not equal. It never has been. The whip changed shape. It became a contract and a market signal. The role of global financial institutions adds another layer, because many coffee-producing countries rely on loans, and loan conditions often push governments toward export-oriented policies, privatization, and reduced support for farmers. And when a government withdraws support, farmers face the market alone, which sounds like freedom in theory and feels like exposure in practice, because farmers do not have diversified income in many regions. They have coffee, maybe a small plot of food, crops, and debt. And when the market collapses, debt remains. And debt pulls people into cycles of migration, informal labor, and sometimes illicit economies. Because people do not stop needing money when coffee prices drop. They just find other ways. And those ways can destabilize societies, which brings us back to geopolitics. because instability invites intervention, and intervention often claims it protects democracy while it protects interests. Commodity speculation also grew in this era. Coffee futures, trade on exchanges, traders bet on price movements driven by frost in Brazil, drought in Vietnam, political unrest in exporting countries, shipping disruptions, currency fluctuations, and those bets can amplify volatility, because when traders pile into a position, they can move prices beyond what supply and demand alone would dictate, and that volatility benefits traders, who can move quickly, and hurts farmers who cannot, and the farmer ends up living inside a casino he never entered willingly, a casino where the dealers sit in New York and London, and the chips are his harvest. Vietnam's rise as a coffee producer illustrates how geopolitics and development policy can reshape the coffee map quickly. Vietnam expanded Robusta production heavily in the late 20th century, partly through government policy and international support, and the influx of Vietnamese coffee increased global supply and contributed to price drops in certain periods, which hurt producers elsewhere, especially small farmers in Latin America and Africa who could not compete on cost. And this shows the brutal logic of the market. One country's development success can become another country's rural crisis, and the winners and losers rarely get to negotiate directly, because the market makes the decision and politicians manage the aftermath. The modern coffee power era also includes a shift in how consumers relate to origin. The specialty coffee movement and what people call the third wave brought origin stories back into marketing. Cafes began listing farm names and regions and processing methods. They treated coffee like wine. They offered tasting notes. They asked consumers to care about provenance. And in some cases, this created better prices for certain producers who could meet specialty demand. Yet it also created a new hierarchy where a small slice of high-quality coffee received attention and premium prices, while the bulk of global coffee remained a low-margin commodity sold in blends and instant products. And the specialty narrative sometimes functioned like a boutique cover over a mass market that still relied on low prices and unequal power. You can see the noir dynamic in the way the industry handles transparency. Brands love to show a farmer holding a basket of cherries. Brands rarely show a ledger. Brands rarely show the true breakdown of how a $5 cup splits among landlord, cafe, roaster, importer, exporter, and farmer. And when journalists try to follow the money, they run into layers of intermediaries and contracts and proprietary pricing, because opacity protects margins, and opacity also protects reputations, because a company can talk about ethical sourcing without revealing whether it pays enough for a farmer to cover costs, and the consumer has limited leverage because the consumer rarely has time to audit a supply chain before work. Coffee also intersects with domestic politics in consumer countries, because companies shape labor conditions in cafes and warehouses. They fight unions, they manage schedules, they control wages, and these labor battles connect back to the same logic upstream: control costs, protect margins, maintain pricing power, and the labor fights in a Seattle cafe might seem unrelated to a farmer in Guatemala, yet both sit inside the same system that treats labor as a cost to minimize and treats branding as the place to invest. And the gap between what companies spend on marketing and what they pay at origin tells you where power resides. This chapter is not a morality play. It is a map of how coffee became embedded in global power structures. Coffee exporting countries became dependent. Consumer countries gained leverage. Corporations built empires on branding. Financial markets turned beans into paper bets. And the collapse of international stabilization agreements exposed farmers to volatility that many could not survive without debt and hardship. And the whole thing continues because coffee feels ordinary. It sits in a mug and looks harmless, and people do not like to think of their morning habit as part of a geopolitical machine. A man in a clean apron draws a neat leaf on the foam and hands over a cup that costs more than a farm worker earns in a day in many coffee regions. And nobody in the line asks the only question that matters: who took the hit, so this cup could feel like a small luxury instead of a complicated supply chain with debt baked into it, because modern coffee does not hide its problems in the dark anymore. It hides them in plain sight, under the glow of a menu board that promises ethics, origin, and community, while the system underneath still runs on the same old math. Start with the split that defines this era. Coffee turned into two industries that share the same raw material and almost nothing else. The mass market sells cheap caffeine at scale through supermarkets, drive-through windows, office machines, pods, instant granules, and branded blends that bury origin. The specialty market sells story and identity through single origin bags, tasting notes, pour-over rituals, barista competitions, micro lots, farm names, and a language that makes coffee sound like fine wine. And both markets draw from the same world of farms and weather. Both markets depend on the same harvest cycles and the same vulnerable hands, yet they distribute money in radically different ways. And even the specialty side that claims it pays better still operates inside a global pricing system that pushes risk downhill. The risk starts at the farm because coffee grows slowly and punishes impatience. A farmer plants trees and waits years for meaningful yield. Then the farmer has to maintain the grove through drought, pests, disease, price swings, and political instability. And the farmer cannot just switch crops when the market shifts, because coffee trees do not move, land does not move, and many farmers do not have spare land anyway. So the farmer takes loans to buy seedlings, fertilizer, tools, and labor. Then the farmer prays the harvest covers the debt. Debt turns into the quiet manager of modern coffee, because debt does not shout. Debt just sits on the table every season and asks for payment, whether the market cooperates or not. Now watch how the market sets the tone. Large parts of the global coffee trade still reference a commodity benchmark that rewards volume and punishes small producers who cannot hedge, cannot store, cannot wait out a bad year, and cannot bargain from a position of strength. And when the benchmark price drops below a farmer's cost of production, the farmer does not negotiate with the market. The farmer absorbs the loss or abandons the crop. And abandonment does not look like a dramatic collapse. It looks like neglected trees, unpaid pickers, kids pulled from school to help in the fields, and migration to cities or across borders, because people do not stop needing money when coffee turns unprofitable. They just stop being able to earn it where they live. Companies understand this, and they still sell coffee with moral language, because moral language sells at retail. A bag that claims responsibility commands a higher price. A cafe that claims it supports farmers attracts customers who want a clean conscience with their caffeine. So brands developed a playbook. They slap a seal on the bag. They add a line about direct relationships. They show a farmer's face. They mention sustainability. They publish a glossy report. And they keep the numbers vague, because numbers invite verification, and verification threatens marketing. And this is where greenwashing finds its home, not just in lies, in selective truth that gives the consumer a story without giving the consumer the ledger. Certifications tried to fix this gap, and they produced mixed results. Some cooperatives use certification premiums to fund community projects or improve processing. Some farmers gain access to buyers who pay more. Some regions build better infrastructure, yet the certification system often demands fees, audits, paperwork, and compliance steps that small farmers struggle to afford. And when a farmer cannot afford the paperwork, the farmer cannot access the label. And when the farmer cannot access the label, the farmer stays trapped in the commodity market. So the label can unintentionally reward the farmers who already have more organization and leave behind those who face the harshest conditions. And even when certification works as intended, It rarely changes the core structure where the consumer pays a premium and the farmer receives a small share of that premium after everyone else takes a cut for processing, exporting, importing, roasting, packaging, rent, labor, marketing, and profit. The specialty market promises a different model through direct trade and relationship sourcing, and that model can raise farm gate prices for certain producers, yet it has limits that the industry does not like to advertise. Specialty buyers purchase a small slice of global supply. The rest still moves through conventional channels, and specialty buyers still demand quality and consistency that require investment, and investment again often requires debt, so a farmer can win a better price and still end up with fragile finances if a single bad harvest ruins the quality, and quality can collapse for reasons that have nothing to do with skill. A storm can knock flowers off, a drought can stunt cherries, a fungus can spread, a labor shortage can delay picking, and delayed picking can ruin cup score. So the modern specialty narrative sells control, while the farm reality delivers constant exposure. Climate pressure now turns exposure into a full-time crisis. Coffee, especially Arabica, grows best within narrow temperature ranges, and as heat rises and rainfall patterns shift, many traditional growing zones face increased stress. Farmers see irregular flowering, unpredictable harvest timing, higher pest pressure, and more frequent extreme events. And the industry responds with talk about resilience, climate-smart agriculture, carbon offsets, and new cultivars. And some of these efforts help, yet they also create a new form of inequality because adaptation costs money, irrigation costs money, shade management costs money, replanting costs money, training costs money, and the farmers with the least money face the highest climate risk. So the system asks the most vulnerable people to finance adaptation for a product that generates huge margins at the retail end, and that mismatch is not a natural disaster. It is a policy choice made by every actor who could share risk and chooses not to. The labor story in modern coffee does not sit in the past tense, it sits in the present tense. Coffee still relies on seasonal labor that often lacks legal protections, and in some regions labor recruiters move workers like cargo. They promise wages, then they dock pay through fees, transport costs, and housing costs, and the worker ends up trapped. And child labor still appears in coffee supply chains in multiple countries, not because children love agriculture, because families lack cash and need hands to meet quotas. And when brands claim they have clean supply chains, they often rely on audits that struggle to detect what families hide out of fear. And the brands also rely on complex networks of intermediaries that muddy accountability, because a brand that buys through layers can always claim it did not know, and ignorance remains the cheapest liability shield in commodity markets. Then you have the new machinery of control, data, and traceability. The industry now talks about blockchain, farm mapping, satellite monitoring, digital payments, and end-to-end transparency. And yes, technology can reduce fraud and improve traceability, yet it can also shift power toward whoever controls the platforms, because data becomes currency. And a farmer who shares data might gain access to a buyer, yet that farmer also exposes business details and land information that a powerful buyer can use to negotiate harder, and the farmer often does not own the system that stores and monetizes the data, so the industry can build a surveillance layer that claims it protects farmers while it tightens procurement control. Regulators have started pushing companies to prove their claims about sustainability and human rights, and new rules in several markets now pressure firms to document where commodities come from and to reduce links to deforestation and forced labor. And compliance can produce real improvements when it forces companies to map their suppliers, yet it can also produce exclusion because compliance burdens fall hardest on smallholders who cannot easily produce documents, maps, and formal titles. And when a company fears legal risk, it may simply stop buying from smallholders and shift to larger estates or regions with cleaner paperwork. And that shift can push the most vulnerable farmers out of formal markets, which does not end harmful production, it just makes it harder to see. Now bring the lens back to the consumer end, because modern coffee also runs on a cultural engine that shapes demand. Social media turned coffee into a performance. A bag of beans becomes a status object. A latte becomes content. A cafe becomes a set. And the third wave scene sells the idea that knowledge equals virtue, that if you know the farm and the processing method, you have done your duty. And that idea allows people to confuse awareness with impact, because knowledge does not change price distribution by itself. Bargaining power changes price distribution, and a consumer can memorize tasting notes and still fund a system that pays farmers too little, because the consumer does not negotiate the farm gate price. Companies and traders do, and companies and traders still optimize for margin unless a force larger than sentiment compels them to do otherwise. Corporate consolidation tightens this logic. A small number of large trading houses and roasters control enormous volume, and they manage risk through hedging and diversification. They shift sourcing across continents when weather hits one region. They renegotiate contracts. They blend. They substitute Robusta for Arabica in certain products when prices rise, and the consumer often does not notice because brands adjust roast profiles and flavoring to keep the product familiar, and that capacity to shift supply gives large buyers leverage over producers, because the buyer can threaten to walk, while the farmer cannot easily threaten to stop producing, and even cooperatives that negotiate collectively still face a market where buyers can wait and producers cannot. This era also includes a cruel irony. The parts of coffee that command high prices often depend on labor-intensive processing and careful hand sorting, which means the quality premium demands more work, not less, and in many places farmers pay higher labor costs to achieve higher quality. Then they hope the buyer recognizes the quality and pays enough to cover those costs, and when the buyer rejects a lot because of minor defects, the farmer can lose the premium and still carry the added costs. So specialty can increase risk even when it increases potential reward. And this creates a psychological trap where farmers chase quality like gamblers chase a payout, because they need a path out of commodity pricing, and the industry celebrates their ambition while leaving them exposed. Look at how the industry talks about the future, and you will hear the word shortage. Analysts warn that climate change will reduce suitable land, that demand will rise in new markets, that prices will spike. And companies use the shortage narrative in two ways. They use it to justify price increases at retail, and they use it to justify investment in new varieties, new origins, and more robust supply chains. Yet the shortage narrative rarely includes the obvious fix: pay farmers more consistently so they can maintain farms and invest in adaptation, because paying more reduces margin unless the company raises prices or accepts lower profit, and many companies would rather sell fear than share margin. In this modern industry chapter, you also have to talk about the quiet churn of farmers leaving coffee, because the most important indicator of system health is not the number of cafes in cities. It is the willingness of young people in growing regions to stay on the land, and in many regions young people look at coffee and see volatility, hard labor, low returns, and debt. Then they choose other paths if they can, and when they cannot, they migrate anyway, and migration drains rural areas of labor and knowledge, which can reduce production and raise costs, which then pressures companies to seek new origins, which then pressures new communities to enter the same treadmill, and the treadmill keeps moving because global demand keeps rising and the retail end keeps printing money. Brands respond with campaigns that look like confession and operate like insurance. They publish impact reports. They announce farmer support programs. They invest in training centers. They fund seedlings. They run pilot projects. And these efforts can help individuals, yet they often function as public relations shields against structural critique, because a pilot project does not change a pricing system, and a training program does not erase debt, and a new seedling does not pay school fees this year. And when a brand funds a program, it often frames the program as generosity, rather than as part of the cost of doing business ethically. Generosity implies optional action, cost implies obligation, and companies prefer optional language, because optional language protects flexibility. At the same time, activists, journalists, and some producer groups have started pushing for new models, living income benchmarks, transparent contracts, longer-term purchasing commitments, profit sharing, and more direct ownership of value-adding steps like milling, exporting, roasting, and branding in producer countries, because the core issue is not that coffee grows in poor places. The core issue is that most value accrues far from where the crop grows, and shifting value requires restructuring who owns processing, who owns logistics, who owns brands, and who can access consumers. And that kind of shift threatens entrenched interests, so it moves slowly, and it meets resistance disguised as concern about quality control, traceability, and market efficiency. Modern coffee also has a propaganda problem on the consumer side, because consumers now face choice overload: pods, instant, ready-to-drink cans, cold brew, nitro, single origin, blends, light roast, dark roast, sugar-free syrups, functional additives, mushroom coffee, protein coffee, and each new product form adds margin and adds distance from the farm. And the more distance a product puts between consumer and origin, the easier it becomes to hide labor conditions and pricing, because a flavored canned drink does not invite questions about farm gate price. It invites questions about calories, and companies prefer questions they can answer with nutrition labels, rather than questions they would rather not answer at all. So the modern industry looks like this. Technology increases traceability and can also increase control. Climate change raises risk and pushes costs downhill. Certification and ethical sourcing can help and can also become marketing armor. Specialty creates premiums and creates new volatility. Corporate consolidation strengthens buyer power, and consumers keep buying because coffee functions as a daily coping tool in a world built on stress and schedules. And that function gives the industry a steady stream of demand that smooths over outrage, because outrage rarely survives the morning when someone needs caffeine and has 10 minutes before work.